Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining me for the good news on May 28th. Well, I have to admit I've been really puzzled by today's gospel. It contains a variety of sayings of Jesus rather than a coherent story, and the topics range from faithfulness to money to the law, and from the kingdom of heaven to divorce, all in only 9 verses. I'm out of my depth on this one. I'll read it now and you can see what you think. This is from the Gospel according to Luke, chapter 16, starting at verse 10. Whoever is faithful in a very little is faithful also in much, and whoever is dishonest in a very little is dishonest also in much. If then you have not been faithful with the dishonest wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches? And if you have not been faithful with what belongs to another, who will give you what is your own? No slave can serve 2 masters, for a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. The Pharisees, who were lovers of money, heard all this, and they ridiculed him. So he said to them, "You are those who justify yourselves in the sight of others, but God knows your hearts. For what is prized by human beings is an abomination in the sight of God." The law and the prophets were in effect until John came. Since then, the good news of the kingdom of God is proclaimed, and everyone tries to enter it by force. But it is easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one stroke of a letter of the law to be dropped. Anyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and whoever marries a woman divorced from her husband commits adultery. This is the gospel of Christ. Well, it's the first verse of this gospel that speaks to me. Whoever is faithful in a very little is faithful also in much, and whoever is dishonest in a very little is dishonest also in much. The rest of the paragraph talks about dishonest wealth versus true riches, and ends with that familiar expression, "You cannot serve God and wealth." So this passage could lead into a discussion about greed and the love of money that gets in the way of the true riches of relationship with God. But today I'd like to focus on a slightly different way of thinking about that first verse. I think it's talking about character. A person who keeps small promises can likely be trusted to keep big ones. A person who hands in a wallet they found to the police station probably won't cheat on their taxes or swindle their customers either. Whoever is faithful in a very little is faithful also in much, and whoever is dishonest in a very little is dishonest also in much. It reminds me that all the little things that we do or don't do matter. And after all, life is more often made up of a series of small opportunities to do the right thing, rather than grand gestures or extreme sacrifices. And there's a bonus that comes with being faithful or honest or loving over and over again in small ways. It's kind of like exercise, training for the bigger opportunities that might come. It's how we build ourselves up from being faithful in a very little to being faithful in much. So it might sound odd to think of training attributes like faithfulness or honesty or caring. Maybe we tend to think of such character traits as being fixed. Well, I just happened to watch a TED Talk about empathy, which sheds some light on this. Psychologists used to think that you had a fairly stable degree of empathy, but research has shown that empathy can be trained, especially once you know that it's not necessarily a fixed characteristic. It's a skill you can improve through practice. I think I've mentioned before a book called Everyday Holiness by Alan Marinas. It's all about a Jewish practice called Mussar, which involves identifying those spiritual traits that are not your strengths and then trying to develop them through simple practices. For instance, if you wanted to become more generous, you could work on giving away money. Let's say you decided you could give away $100. Rather than giving it as a lump sum, you could give it away $1 at a time, because the repeated action of reaching into your wallet reinforces the tendency towards more generosity. Or if you're short-tempered, vowing to never lose your temper again probably won't work, but you could practice always counting to 10 before reacting to an irritation. Mussar describes these sorts of practices as a spiritual curriculum. And that makes me think of school and reminds me of Graham's description of the church as a school for love. Well, our school for love at St. George's is all about distance learning during the pandemic, but there's still homework that we can do. When we're limited in what we can do, then all the small things done with love become even more significant. Things like practicing patience for those we're cooped up with, or prayers and phone calls and letters for those we're separated from. All these ways of being faithful in very little things can make this a time of spiritual growth. And I think there is some good news in that. I'd like to end today with a short meditation from Embers, a book by Richard Wagamese. It is love that brings us all together. This human family that we are all part of, this singular voice that is the accumulation of all voices raised together in praise of all creation. This one heartbeat, this one drum, this one immaculate love that put us here together so that we could learn its primary teaching, that love is the energy of creation, that it takes love to create love. Well, it's been cold here in Howdenvale the last few days, but the turtles are out laying eggs and the yellow lady slippers are blooming. Signs of life and hope are all around. Thank you for listening today. Have a great weekend, and I will hope to see you on Sunday at our Zoom coffee hour.